Hello and thank you for joining us, and welcome to this DSW webinar, which is focused on the topic of non-assessed portfolios that are used within endpoint assessments. I'm Jake Tween and I'm DSW's Head of Apprenticeships, and I'm going to take the next 20 minutes or so with my colleague Alison Lyon to just talk through non-assessed portfolios. So what are they, when are they used, what does good practice look like, how are they actually coupled with assessed methods, and what can you use to help support your apprentices to prepare for their endpoint assessment and building those non-assessed portfolios. So we'll start with a brief introduction to DSW and Alison and I. Then I'm going to talk to you about the purpose of the non-assessed portfolio within an EPA. And then I'm going to hand over to Alison, and she's going to talk about evidence types, how much evidence to include, which is a really common question that we get, and then also mapping of evidence, so how that's mapped and referenced against the individual learning outcomes in the standard. Then Alison's going to hand back to me, and I'm going to talk to you a little bit about how to prepare your apprentices for their interview or their professional discussion, because where there's a non-assessed portfolio, it's usually coupled with an assessment method, which is usually an interview or discussion, and then I'll close with a summary. So as I mentioned, my name is Jake Tween. I'm Head of Apprenticeships with DSW. I've worked in vocational technical education since 2006. Since the introduction of the apprenticeship levy, I've specialised in apprenticeships and endpoint assessment in particular. I'll hand over to my colleague Alison for her to introduce herself.
Hello, I'm Alison Lyon. I'm the product lead for DSW. So I'm responsible for looking after the creation of all our collateral to support our endpoint assessment. Like Jake, I have a background in training over the last 9 years, and prior to that I spent a long time working in financial services.
Thank you, Alison. So DSW is an ESFA approved endpoint assessment organisation. We're also an Ofqual approved awarding organisation. We've got a very broad range of standards. So we started off specialising in financial services, which is our business's heritage. But in recent years, we've expanded the portfolio into other areas such as business administration, management and HR. So we're currently delivering endpoint assessment on behalf of over 2,000 employers across 122 different training providers, and working with all sorts of providers, including FE colleges, sixth forms, independent training providers, universities and local authorities. Okay, so to kick us off, I'm just going to talk a little bit about the purpose of the non-assessed portfolio, because this is one of the common questions that we get asked is, okay, if it's not assessed, then what's the point in it? Why should our apprentices invest any time in producing something that isn't ultimately assessed? And to all intents and purposes, I think the advice that I would give to apprentices is to still put in as much effort. Although it's not directly assessed, the portfolio is as important, and in some ways actually even more important than it was when it was an assessed component. And I'm going to kind of talk to you a little bit about why we think that is. So the portfolio of evidence really provides the independent endpoint assessor with examples of the actual work that apprentices has been doing over the last 12 months, 18 months, 2 years, however long they've been on programme. Because quite often you'll get apprentices who are, really performing well in their role, and they're excellent at their job, and they're very well thought of by their employers. But if they haven't understood the assessment and they haven't given examples and evidence of that work, then they'll struggle when they come to EPA. So by having the non-assessed portfolio, you're given actual examples of evidence for the assessor to look at, to kind of start to form their opinions, but then also to help the assessor to prepare for the interview and the discussion. So which areas are they going to focus on? What road do they want to take the apprentice down? What do they really want to explore and dig into? So I mentioned before that wherever you have a non-assessed portfolio, it will always be accompanied by an assessment method. And usually it's an interview or it's a professional discussion. So the interview or professional discussions typically takes place between the apprentice and the independent endpoint assessor who would be appointed by DSW. Sometimes there's a panel interview where the employer might be involved, but usually it's between the apprentice and the assessor. So the non-assessed portfolio of evidence acts as that basis for that interview or that professional discussion. It provides background context, and the key thing here is that it really saves time within that interview of the discussion. So where we had assessed portfolios previously, the apprentice could invest a lot of time in putting together their portfolio of evidence and kind of ticking a lot of those learning outcomes off, before they even get to their EPA. But because it's a non-assessed portfolio now, what that means is that the actual assessment method is now very, very high stakes. So if it's an interview, for example, even if the portfolio of evidence is really, really good, if the apprentice doesn't perform well in that interview, they will ultimately fail and they'll be required to resit it. So having a really robust portfolio of evidence helps to provide that background context to the assessor. So for example, if the apprentice submits a portfolio of evidence and the assessor thinks it's quite weak, it's not clear to me how it meets the learning outcomes or that it's relevant, it's not validated or authenticated in any way, they're going to spend a lot of their time in that interview exploring that background context with the apprentice. So, okay, when did this happen? Who was involved? Talk me through the process that you did. And what you'll find is that the apprentice will run out of time because quite often there are a lot of learning outcomes to cover in a short space of time. Whereas flip that on its head, if the apprentice has really invested the time and put together a robust portfolio that's really clearly mapped to the learning outcomes, there's product evidence in there that validates it, there's witness testimonies from their line manager, the assessor's already got that background context before they even go into the interview. So the interview is very much focused on kind of specific elements of it, and it becomes more of a validation exercise of what the assessor's already seen. Whereas if all of the evidence in the portfolio is really poor, like I say, you're going to waste a lot of time kind of explaining what happened, who was involved, and the apprentice will ultimately run out of time. So it's really important actually that the portfolio is, robust, well referenced, and has a lot of product evidence in it as well. The other good thing about the non-assessed portfolio of evidence is it gives the assessor another lens through which to observe the apprentice's performance. So the apprentice might submit kind of context statements and an account of what they did and some performance evidence to back that up. But if there are also things in there like witness testimonies, one-to-ones and appraisal forms, it allows the assessor to see how that apprentice is viewed by others within their workplace, and in particular their line manager. And while that doesn't necessarily directly affect the assessor's judgment because they are independent, it does kind of help them to form, kind of almost triangulate that evidence and see it from a different angle and form an opinion that's based on all of the evidence that's available. So when can the evidence be gathered? Typically, in our experience, where there's a non-assessed portfolio, the apprentice can start gathering the evidence from day one, and they can gather it throughout that whole on-programme period. And the requirement is that the non-assessed portfolio is submitted along with all of the other gateway documents. And once it's been submitted, the apprentice can no longer add to it. They can't change anything in it. And the assessor will review it, but the assessor is not allowed to provide any feedback. And that's been made very clear by the regulators that endpoint assessment organisations shouldn't be providing feedback ahead of that interview or that professional discussion. So again, it's really important that it's robust and that the apprentice's skills coach is really supported them in pulling together the evidence, making sure that it's really clear and that it's mapped to those learning outcomes. So I'm going to hand over to Alison now, who's going to talk to you about the different types of evidence that we'd expect to see in a non-assessed portfolio.
Thank you, Jake. So one of the questions that we often get asked is around the types of evidence and how to start sort of building a portfolio. So could I have the next slide, please?
Yep.
Thank you. So a good place to start with building a portfolio is to produce a context statement. So a context statement is a short written account of the situation that the apprentice has been involved in. So think of it as the glue that holds the portfolio together. It's there to provide clarity and context for the evidence. It's really important to remember the context statement itself is not assessed. So it just needs to be brief. So perhaps one page of A4 outlining that situation that the apprentice has been involved in. So it's almost used to hang the evidence from. It's really important to remember that a apprentices are not allowed to include any self-evaluation within the portfolio. So just bear that in mind when they are writing context statements and including evidence. So one of the things that you can do within a context statement, if you choose to, is embed some pieces of evidence in there. If you feel it's appropriate and if you feel it helps to demonstrate that point and add clarity at that particular point in time, then you can choose to embed it. Alternatively, you can map that evidence in using the reference table, and we'll talk about that in a little bit more detail shortly. Typically, we would see around 3 or 4 context statements included within a portfolio, but that really does depend on the particular standard, the number of outcomes that are applicable, and the actual situation that the apprentice is talking about. So we say typically that's what we often see. So a good piece of evidence, and I suppose really we call it the gold standard piece of evidence, is a work product. So that's proof that what the apprentice is talking about did happen. So that might be something like an email, training records, an extract from a project, maybe some of your internal regulations that has been included as evidence within the portfolio. What's really key to remember when including any piece of evidence within the portfolio is that it's redacted. So, you know, anything that's commercially sensitive and anything that's going to constitute a GDPR breach is removed before it's submitted to us. Another piece of evidence that can be used within a portfolio is an observation record. Now, typically that will be completed by the skills coach, and that is where they would observe an apprentice carrying out a task. That can be done face to face, or it can be done remotely. It's not something we see used too much within portfolios, but it is a good way of evidencing an apprentice's performance. So it is something that can be used if you choose to. So the apprentice's appraisal documentation is a really good way of them evidencing their performance and their behaviours, and it's been verified by the line manager. So, you know, it gives proof that that is a true account of that apprentice. What's really key, though, to remember when submitting an appraisal is that it does help to meet those learning outcomes and that it's mapped correctly to the evidence, to the outcome that it's trying to evidence. And again, as I said before, make sure that anything commercially sensitive has been removed. Make sure that the appraisal doesn't refer to any other individuals. So witness testimonies are a really good way of providing evidence within a portfolio. They typically will be completed by the line manager, but it does need to be done by somebody that is a peer of the apprentice. Most times we do see those voice recorded. They can be written though if you choose to. If you are voice recording, please make sure that they are time-stamped, that they're mapped on the referencing table. I think one of the things that's really key here is that the line manager is familiar with the outcomes that the apprentice is trying to meet. We do see some really good witness testimonies that talk about the apprentice, about how great they are at the job, but if they don't help to meet the learning outcomes, then you know there is no value in adding that. So it's key that it does map to some particular learning outcomes. So a knowledge statement is a really good way of an apprentice meeting some of the outcomes that perhaps have command verbs such as explain and evaluate. So it's a short written account of something that they've done. What you need to bear in mind and be careful of is that a lot of the newer assessment plans do actually mix the knowledge, the skills and the behaviours together. So there are some outcomes that will ask you to evaluate and demonstrate. So it's key that the apprentice understands those command verbs, and that if they're asked to evaluate and demonstrate, they do both of those things in full to meet that outcome. So something else that can be used within a portfolio is a professional discussion. and that's a really organic way of gathering evidence. It's often used to gap fill, for example, where an apprentice has used context statements and there are a couple of outcomes that perhaps aren't met in full because that situation hasn't allowed them to demonstrate that particular skill or knowledge or behaviour. So a professional discussion is a good way of gathering that evidence and being able to submit that. What's really key with a professional discussion is that the skills coach doesn't lead the apprentice. We've seen a couple of those where that's been the case. So, you know, it should be organic, it should be a natural conversation. Again, if they are voice recorded, then please make sure that they're time stamped and that they're mapped to the referencing table to the outcomes. So I think the best portfolios that we see tend to be the appropriate number of context statements that outline some complex scenarios, and they're underpinned and validated by product evidence, by performance evidence. So our assessor can see and that it's been proven to them that that scenario actually took place and the apprentice has demonstrated the skills, knowledge and behaviours that are required by the standard. Okay, so we're going to move on to the next slide now, and we're going to look at how much evidence needs to be included within a portfolio. So it's something that we get asked a lot, and it's something that can be quite difficult to answer. A lot of the new assessment plans do actually help us with that because they will set some parameters within the plan. So I would say starting point when looking at how much evidence to include would be to refer to our toolkit. So a lot of the plans now will say that, you know, typically there's between 10 and 15 pieces of evidence. If the word typically is used, then we will allow some flexibility. If the plan is very precise and it says a minimum of 10, a maximum of 15, then those parameters will be applied. So as I said, make sure that you do refer to the toolkit. So a piece of evidence then could include a number of documents. So for example, a context statement could include 5 or 6 pieces of standalone evidence that sort of prove that that scenario the apprentice is talking about took place. So depending on the scenario talking about, that could be constituted as one piece of evidence. I think what's key to remember is that it's a showcase portfolio. So it's the apprentice giving their best examples of work that they've completed during the apprenticeship. What's really important is that we don't have lots of evidence thrown at it to see what sticks. You know, pick those best pieces out and give those to us. Also remember that an assessor only has a certain amount of time to review the portfolio. So maybe typically sort of 3 or 4 hours. So make sure that the mapping is clear. Make sure that those pieces of evidence are the right bits. Make sure that the descriptor has been covered in full. So something that we include within our toolkits is amplification. So that's where we will give some guidance on the depth, the scope and the breadth of the evidence that is required to meet an outcome. So if an outcome asks for a couple of examples, our amplification will explain how many examples are required in order to meet that outcome. So, you know, make sure that you're familiar with that. Make sure the apprentice is familiar with that. So, and lastly, I would say pay attention to the command verb. So there are lots of words out there in the outcomes. So evaluate, explain, demonstrate. So make sure that you pay attention to that verb and make sure that if it asks you to evaluate something, that has actually been done. Okay, so we're now going to move on and look at mapping of the evidence. So all of the evidence must be mapped to one or more of the descriptors. However, holistic coverage of the descriptors is allowed. So by that, I mean that a single piece of evidence can be used to meet multiple descriptors. And I think what's really key to remember is that just saying a piece of evidence meets the descriptor isn't really mapping and isn't going to help the assessor to build a picture of that apprentice. So put yourself in the assessor's shoes and make it clear which piece of evidence meets the descriptor. So tell them how it does, tell them where they can find it. So for example, if you include a report that you've written as you feel that it demonstrates your written communication style, then make sure that it's clear to the assessor why that's been included and how it meets the particular descriptor that it's been mapped to. So if you're going to use time recordings, then please make sure they're time stamped and keep them to a sensible length. As I said, an assessor has typically 3 or 4 hours to review the portfolio. Make sure that the recording has a proper introduction. Make sure that it explains the purpose of the recording. Make sure that the assessor can actually validate that that is the apprentice's own work. So each of our toolkits contain a referencing table, and it's a requirement that that is completed and submitted alongside the portfolio. So think of it as sort of a roadmap to the portfolio, and bear in mind that our assessors need to look at that and need to be able to navigate the portfolio and find the pieces of evidence and understand which outcomes they map to. So we've done a lot of work recently around the mapping of evidence, and we've come up with some principles to follow when mapping evidence, and we've done that in collaboration with yourselves through feedback that you've given us and thoughts that you've shared with us. So what I would say though is that that feedback loop is always open, so if you do have any ideas on how we can make things a little easier or improvements that we can make, then please do give us that feedback. And lastly, dates and signatures. So as we said previously, the evidence collection period tends to be throughout the duration of the apprenticeship programme, but that does differ across standards. So refer to the toolkit, but equally our assessor needs to be able to validate that that example the apprentice is talking about did actually occur on the date that's within the right time frame. So, you know, we need to make sure that the evidence is dated, and that's the date that particular situation occurred, not the date the apprentice has pulled that evidence and written about it. So one of the things that we have seen used within portfolio is a contents page which lists all the evidence and gives the date that that example occurred. So if that's something you want to use, then that is acceptable to us. And lastly, signatures. So there is a requirement that a couple of pieces of evidence within the portfolio are signed, and they are witness testimony and observations. So they require a digital signature, you know, using something like Adobe Sign perhaps, or a wet signature. There is no requirement for the other pieces of evidence within a portfolio to be signed, and that is covered by the declaration that the apprentice completes and fills in at Gateway.
Thank you very much, Alison. I think that's perfectly kind of described really what we said at the beginning of the session, is that the principles that underpin the development of the portfolio are broadly speaking the same for a non-assessed portfolio as they are for an assessed portfolio. So for those of you who are watching and listening who, you know, have experience of building portfolios, a lot of that will be familiar, but you should take comfort in the fact then that the practice, the good practice that you've developed still applies, and if you stick to those key principles and really support the apprentice in understanding the purpose of the portfolio and how they can best present it, then they will have a good experience in their EPA, and the likelihood is they'll come away with a good outcome as well. So thank you, Alison. So I just wanted to talk now about really the next stage, which is preparing the apprentice for that interview or that discussion. And as I mentioned at the start, wherever there's a non-assessed portfolio of evidence, it's always coupled with an actual assessment method. And, you know, usually that assessment method is an interview or it's a professional discussion. So I really just wanted to give some hints and tips around what you can do to help your apprentices to prepare for that assessment method. And this is based on our team's experience here at DSW, but also feedback that we've had from assessors. You know, we've carried out thousands and thousands of endpoint assessments now, so we've got a rich vein of kind of feedback that we're getting. So this all comes from real recent experience, really. So the key thing to remember is that with the newer standard, newer style assessment plans, so certainly anything that was published in the last sort of 18 months or so, they're very clear now what the past descriptors are that must be met, and also which of the assessment methods each of those descriptors is assigned to. So those of you who are familiar with some of the kind of older assessment plans from the early days of standards will know that sometimes it was a bit of a free-for-all, so you'd have a list of learning outcomes and it really wasn't clear how they were assessed and in which method. That's not the case anymore. The standards and assessment plans are becoming more sophisticated, and so anything that was published recently which has a non-assessed portfolio in it, it'll be really clear what the assessment method is and which of those past descriptors are required to be met in that method. Typically speaking, and actually I think in all of the ones that I've seen, the apprentice has to meet all of those past descriptors in order to pass that method. So it really is a high stakes assessment now. So for example, if there's an assessment method which is a portfolio based interview, having a great portfolio is really important, but it really depends on how the apprentice performs in that interview. That's what they're going to be graded upon. So if there are 10 questions in the interview and 10 descriptors, and the apprentice nails 9 of them, but they get one of them wrong, they will ultimately fail that interview. So essentially what we're talking about here is a 100% pass mark for these assessments. So it's really important that the apprentice is familiar with those descriptors and can talk confidently about how what they've done, the work they've done, meets those descriptors in full for each of them. So preparation and understanding of the assessment is really, really important, more so than it ever has been before. So in addition to the past descriptors, each assessment method will also have some distinction descriptors which are prescribed to it. And that's the apprentice's opportunity to, in their portfolio of evidence, to demonstrate how they think they've met that distinction descriptor, and then in their interview or their discussion to talk about that and to convince the assessor that they're at that distinction level. So if the apprentice meets all of those past descriptors and the distinction descriptors in their interview, they'll get a distinction for that component. And again, familiarity with those descriptors is absolutely essential for a good experience and a good performance. So typically speaking, where there's an interview or discussion, the apprentice can take notes into the interview with them. But what I would say is check the toolkit, because there are 1 or 2 standards where it's clear in the assessment plan that they can't. So do check the toolkit to see what the rules are, but usually there's something in there that says they can bring in notes. Sometimes it says that they can take in a copy of their portfolio. I'm not sure how practical that is. Sometimes we have apprentices who like to take a copy of the past descriptors of the learning outcomes with them. So to check the toolkit is what I'm saying, and it will tell you what the guidelines are, but make use of those. So if it does say they can take notes in, then very much encourage the apprentice to take notes, but notes that they can refer to kind of as a reference point rather than taking in a big ring binder and looking down at that the whole time. It's really important that they engage and maintain eye contact with the assessor. So really notes that just kind of, trigger something in their brain. Okay, this is the example I'm going to use, or this is what I want to focus on. It's really important. And then finally, the last tip is use the toolkit to understand kind of how many questions are likely to be asked in that interview discussion. So with the newer style assessment plans, usually it tells us as an endpoint assessment organisation, okay, there's an interview, it's an hour long, and you've got to ask 8 questions from a bank. And so if the apprentice knows that, then they've got a good idea of kind of how long they should be spending on each of the questions, so that they give an answer that's detailed and thorough enough, but also that they don't kind of go off topic and spend too long focusing on one question. So that information is really useful to the apprentice. And in all of our toolkits as well, we'll have mock questions and mock discussion points for that endpoint assessment. So again, use those with the apprentice so they're familiar with the format, they're familiar with the type of question, and can start to think about and practice how they're going to respond to those questions. Okay, so I just wanted to close with a little bit of a summary, really, just to cover off some of the key points that we've covered today. So the portfolio, although it's not assessed, we cannot say this enough, it remains a critical component of the EPA, and certainly the training providers whom I've spoken to, that's very much the position that they're continuing to take, and in the conversations that they're having with their apprentices is, reinforcing how important that portfolio is, because it helps the apprentice to build familiarity with the learning outcomes, the past descriptors. It helps the assessor to understand what the apprentice has done. It provides evidence, authentication, validation that has happened. It provides those extra points of view from the witness testimonies in the appraisal documentation and things like that. And it just means that that interview, that professional discussion, is going to be a lot leaner. It's going to focus more on kind of the in-depth areas that the apprentice wants, the assessor wants to explore, and actually is more likely to produce a distinction level performance, because the assessor can focus on those rather than spending that hour trying to figure out what happened, who was involved, when it happened, all of those critical context questions that the assessor needs to know that actually can be covered off in that portfolio and should be. So the next point is that clear mapping is essential. It's ultimately the apprentice's responsibility to map their evidence. So in the toolkit, we'll always provide a referencing table which will list all of the descriptors, and there's the opportunity there for the apprentice to say which bits of evidence map to each of those. But Alison said it earlier, and I think it's a really important point, is, tell the apprentice to put themselves in the position of the assessor. If you as the apprentice, if you can demonstrate to the assessor that you're well organised and that you can, articulate things clearly and, make it clear to the assessor where your work is, and you've got a good blend of different types of evidence in there, they're going to have a very high opinion of you, not just as an apprentice, but also as a professional in your occupation. And certainly if I were going into an assessment and I had an opportunity to impress the assessor with the work that I'd done and make their life easy to speak candidly, I would do it. They're only human, so I think you're only going to help the apprentice by getting them into that mindset. Alison made the point earlier, and it's a really important one. What we're looking for in the portfolio is a showcase of the best pieces of work. We don't want to see anything and everything that the apprentice has done, because what that often does is it obscures the best work. Really help the apprentice to kind of collect as they go along is a good way of doing it, and then towards the end start to think, right, okay, well, what are my best examples? How can I write about those and draw upon evidence to prove that it happened? So really a showcase is what we're looking for. Understanding those descriptors is absolutely essential. If the apprentice goes into that interview or that professional discussion and they know all of those past descriptors inside out and those distinction descriptors inside out, as soon as they're asked the question, they're going to know what it is that they need to say in order to tick that box, because the questions can only and will only focus on those descriptors. Our assessor's not going to go and start asking random questions about stuff that's not in that assessment plan. That would be a waste of time. The questions will always focus on the descriptors, so it stands to reason that if you understand those descriptors very well, you're going to be able to understand the question and you're going to be able to answer it efficiently. And in that same vein, the familiarity with the portfolio is important, and this is particularly important if there are examples in the portfolio that were from the early stages of the apprenticeship. I wouldn't want to go into an interview with somebody and they ask me to talk about something I did 18 months ago. I would find it very difficult to remember, and certainly to remember in sufficient detail. But if I'd spent some time ahead of that going through my portfolio and refreshing my memory of what happened and looking at the examples that I'd put in there, I'd feel a lot more confident and I think I would perform better. And finally, just the last point is that, I said it before, the interview, the discussion now, it's a really high stakes assessment, because while we're encouraging the apprentice to put all of that effort into the portfolio for all of the reasons that we've just described, at the end of the day, they have to perform in that hour or in that hour and a half, or however long they've got in front of that assessor. They have to perform there and then. So the practice is essential, and the apprentice needs to understand the importance of the interview and the discussion. So making sure that they feel prepared, that they've had plenty of options to ask any questions that they've got, they understand the process, they know how to use the technology, and everything runs as smoothly as it possibly can on the day. So really that was it from Alison and I. Hopefully you've enjoyed the session, and if you have, please feel free to give it a like, and also do feel free, Alison mentioned around feedback. We are always looking to learn and to develop, and the feedback that we get from you guys is essential to that. So please do get in touch if you've got anything good or bad, constructive, any suggestions, and we're all ears and we'd love to speak to you. So thank you very much for your time, and enjoy the rest of your day, and good luck with the apprenticeships. Thank you.